that, guys. We're going to try the freestanding microphone and see if this works. Yay, it does. So good afternoon, everybody. Hard to follow on from those fantastic presentations this morning, but we'll give it a go. So Cathy and I and our colleagues, so we have Dr. Deirdre, who's here with us in the room, and who's going to be chairing the panel session shortly, supported by another colleague, Laura Devlin, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us this morning. We're contracted by PQI at the very start of this year to conduct an evaluation of the AQR process itself, i.e. the method by which you guys complete that template and submit your AQRs to PQI on an annual basis. And part of that, we were being asked to determine the extent to which that process is fulfilling its stated purpose and to identify any possible enhancements that can be made either to the process or to the AQR template itself. So Cathy and I are delighted to be here presenting our findings on behalf of that wider evaluation project team. And there's one thing that I'd really like to note just at the outset of this, and that was that the evaluation was really warmly welcomed by all of the stakeholders that we engaged with as part of the project, and a number of contributors to the project made really positive comments about the open and the consultative manner in which PQI was quality assuring its own processes. So just wanted to acknowledge that at the outset. I'm going to go quickly through some of these slides because I know we are really strictly managing time this afternoon. But just briefly, what is the AQR process? So PQI has articulated really clearly in its documentations that the AQRs form a really important element of PQI's own monitoring and external oversight function. But they sit within a wider regulatory framework. And there is an intended synergy between the AQR reports and other functions that PQI has in the space, such as institutional review, and that's set out in the various PQI documentation. These things are intended to be mutually supportive and reinforcing.
I'm going to very briefly take you through the evaluation methodology, and if you were one of those key stakeholders who made input to each of these methods, apologies, just bear with us, so I'll take a couple of minutes to recap for everybody else. So we had really good engagement, as Deirdre said, from the sector. The evaluation was multimodal, so we had surveys, we had focus groups, we had interviews, and collected a lot of rich data. I think that we had very enviable response rates on our surveys from public and private sector HEIs, and thank you to all of those people who made input. We know it was a very long survey. We promised it would be shorter next time we do a survey, so you know, owning that one. So the surveys were a really helpful baseline, and they were followed by focus groups. So we had a number of focus groups with public HEIs and private HEIs. They were opportunities for really rich dialogue, and as much as telling us what you had to say, you were telling each other, and I think it was really useful to have that opportunity for colleagues in those sectors to talk to each other. The focus groups were not intended to achieve consensus, they were intended to facilitate dialogue and to elicit the diversity of views that was there across the sector, and I think anyone that participated in those would know that was definitely successful. We also conducted stakeholder interviews with key people in the sector, so obviously stakeholders from QQI, from the department, HEA, IUA, THEA and HECA. So there was good representation across the board. Those interviews added to and enhanced the overall evaluation. So, last but not least, was the document review. So we had the privilege, let's say, of looking very closely at 20 public sector annual quality reports and 24 private sector annual quality reports. On average, they're about 150 to 200 pages in length. So we took a good amount of time wading through those, but I have to say it was a really interesting process. And gave us great insight into the huge amount of work that goes into preparing those documents. We, of course, also looked at the template and at previous thematic analysis reports, so looking at previous years. So, fairly holistic methodology. I'm going to hand back to Deirdre now, I think, just to overview some of the findings.
Thanks, Cathy. So all of of the data collection activities that Cathy has just described focus really explicitly on evaluating the effectiveness of the AQR in fulfilling its stated purposes and identifying ways in which the current process and template could be further enhanced. So within that overarching objective, there were some sub-objectives that were defined, and those were to identify whether, beyond sort of just meeting a regulatory requirement, ticking a box essentially, the AQR is perceived to be supporting the development and the implementation of quality assurance within institutions. You guys invest a tremendous amount of time and effort in completing these documents. They should be serving you as well. Are they, or is there a perception that they are? The second objective was to gain an insight into whether the AQR is contributing to the Cathy review process by forming part of the evidence base that is considered by review panels. We looked at whether or not the AQR is providing sufficient and adequate detail to KQI to fulfill its regulatory obligations. We tried to identify the extent to which the AQR or the thematic analysis reports that we were looking at this morning inform or could inform the work of other wider regulatory stakeholders such as the Department of Further and Higher Education and or the Higher Education Authority. And then to identify whether the current process, template, submission process, timelines, all of that kind of logistical piece are optimal, or whether or not they could be further enhanced. So there are 5 stated purposes and a 6th unstated purpose, which is implicit in the report template and which is widely understood. So if we just take a quick look, this is the scorecard, I suppose, that comes out at the end of the evaluation process. So the first stated purpose is to provide documentary evidence of the development and evolution of a provider's QA system. And there was a high level of consensus across all of the stakeholders actually, and KQI itself, that the AQR is useful or somewhat useful in achieving this particular purpose. There were some mixed views from private providers in particular on this, and that's something that we might come back to shortly. The second purpose is to provide KQI with assurance that the internal QA procedures that providers have established are actually being implemented. So whilst the AQRs do tell us that those QA procedures are in place, and you describe the procedures and you linked them and so on, they tell us very little about how those procedures are implemented and their impact. And it's that impact piece, I guess, that there was a little bit of vulnerability around. So this was observed by both KQI and by providers themselves to be a little bit of a gap. The HEIs who responded recognised this weakness, and they identified themselves the challenges around capturing and demonstrating impact in the report template. The third purpose is to assist providers with document management for the institutional review process for KQI. We received kind of conflicting views on this one actually. There was some positive feedback that the AQR process operates as a useful reference point for providers when they're completing the ISO, the Institutional Self-Evaluation report. However, what was also noted was a lack of harmonisation between those two templates, and that can sometimes hinder the effectiveness of that, or the mutually supporting nature of those documents. So purpose 4 is to form part of the evidence base considered by external review teams. So that's your Cathy teams, for example. And what we really need to emphasise here is that the evidence base to inform our conclusions here was limited because we weren't in a position to engage with panel members directly. There was often quite a long time lag between reviews and this particular evaluation, and so that wasn't considered a particularly fruitful line of inquiry at that stage. However, we did hear from you through the surveys and the focus groups that panel members didn't necessarily ask about or didn't seem to be very aware of the AQRs when they interacted with you during the site visits. Purpose 5 is to provide transparency and institutional assurance and enhancement of quality to external stakeholders. So the AQRs are published, so they are achieving transparency in that regard. But an interesting finding that came out was the need to be aware of the unintended consequences of publishing these documents, because once they're in the public domain, they're out there and they can be used in ways for which they may not have been intended. An example of that was perhaps to inform funding decisions, such as springboard decisions by other entities. So that was just something that came up. So the sixth implicit purpose is to enable and support peer learning and enhancement activities, such as the event that we're having today. And across the board, unanimously, it was felt that this is being met, that this purpose is being met. And there was huge support for the case studies in particular. In fact, one of the recommendations, and something that you all told us, was that you would really like an opportunity to build on the AQR and have an opportunity to discuss further in person the wonderful case studies that are submitted through them. So and KQI is today responding to that one in particular.
So one of the other things that we looked at is the purposes that the AQR achieves in practice. So Deirdre's taken you through our findings in relation to the intended or stated purpose, but we had a lot of input from you across the sector regarding what the AQR actually in practical terms means in the life of an institution. And one of the interesting things to note here is that we found the distinction between public and private sector didn't have much explanatory value in relation to this question. We found very much that within the established universities and remaining institutes of technology, where processes were perhaps long established, that the AQR seemed to be positioned as a bit of an add-on. It's sort of adjacent to the internal QA system, a bureaucratic necessity. We were told, we should do this because QQI wants it from us, but it's not necessarily serving as a crucial function internally or feeding into or integrating with the internal QA system of the institution. But we had very, very different input from the technological universities that were newly formed and merging and in the process of merging, and also from the larger private providers, which have been really developing their processes, I suppose, on the path toward greater autonomy. So in those contexts, we have more recently developing, emerging or merging QA systems. We found that the AQR had been positioned quite intentionally as a centralised mechanism, and so people in that sector were actually finding it a really, really useful tool. So that was kind of an interesting, I suppose, contrast and probably worth reflection on. One particular group of small but very important providers in Irish higher education are what we call the niche HEIs, very, very small, but very, very focused and very highly expert in their domains. For those small, or even you might say micro providers, the AQR instrument seemed too overwhelmingly complex, and so we had some input from smaller providers that actually a modified form of the AQR or some other form of recording would be more appropriate. So that breakdown between public-private, slightly different in terms of how the AQR feeds into institutional processes. Okay, so as with any evaluation, there were a series of recommendations at the end of that. I've been tasked with sharing the low-hanging fruit. These are what we would say are the easy recommendations to implement. We had input from the sector that there was a request to adjust the timelines on the call for the AQR and to move these forward. To consider alternative submission mechanisms, and I know QQI will probably acknowledge that they're also dissatisfied with some elements of the portal that was being used, to provide specific guidance to limit the overall length. So there is a lot of variance across the sector, and Deirdre and I have had a few years now, along with Annie and also Alexandra and Matthew, of wading through them, and there is a huge variance in terms of depth and detail in the reports. So perhaps some guidance on word length and what's expected in particular sections. The sector across the board, stakeholders in the sector requested more feedback. So they said that the AQR goes in and then they're not sure whether it's what QQI wanted, and so they would like a bit more responsiveness and a bit more feedback on their performance in that area. The quality meetings that QQI was holding or does hold currently with providers were noted to be highly valued, and there was a kind of a strong call for those to be continued. The published reports, the idea that these might be highlighted to key stakeholders or kind of a little bit more, I suppose, a little bit more razzle-dazzle and publicity around them requested. And then, last but not least, consider promoting the AQR and the outcomes of the AQR through in-person events, and I think we can see that in action today. I'm going to hand back to Deirdre for the slightly harder recommendations.
Thanks, Cathy. So one of the things that we discussed earlier is that whilst providers clearly understand the intended purposes of the AQR, there was less certainty, maybe more ambiguity around it, the purpose in practice and the extent to which the AQR is truly valued. Some of the feedback was, as we've just heard, that providers would like more feedback from PQI on their individual submissions, feedback generally on the template, etc. There was some concern that the ability of the AQR to support the review process is not being maximised currently, and that there could be more done in that regard. Future role of the AQR and how that can be harnessed, there's some mixed views around that also, both within PQI and actually from stakeholders themselves. As we said at the start, we did also speak to some external stakeholders, the HEA, the department, for example, and they were very strong in saying that they are interested and would use an annual quality report, and they indicated some areas that they would like to see in that also. So in terms of our recommendations to PQI then, what we have said is that it is important to clarify the future function of the AQR and integrate that process into emerging wider context of reporting obligations, so that there is a consistency in it there with the reporting requirements of the department, the HEA, etc., so that you're reducing the bureaucratic burden on providers, we're not duplicating activity. We also recommended that there be continued discussion with the sector in the context of ongoing review and development of the monitoring policy, so that the various means by which PQI is interacting with you as providers around monitoring and review can be supportive and interlinked. So there's a sequence to doing this, kind of a logical sequence to how things could be done. So what we suggested was that really you need to nail down the purpose of the AQR and how you want it to function before you start messing with the template and sending kind of mixed messages. So what we suggest is align the template to whatever the clarified purpose is, and then once you have that done, align and integrate the AQR with the other monitoring and review processes.
And I suppose in terms of potential enhancements and also potential purposes for the AQR, we wanted to share with you some of the kind of mixed views and diversity of views that came forward in the evaluation. So you can see, include more data, remove the lawful, so people didn't hold back on that one, but also a sense that it's actually really hard to identify what belongs in these reports. How do you really show transparency and accountability? How do you demonstrate quality assurance and quality enhancement? How do you make space for peer learning across the sector? And how do you do that all within one instrument? One of the interesting points in our evaluation is that from the sector we heard a bit of resistance to the suggestion that the reports could contain more quantitative data. There is a lot of diversity in the reports, but generally speaking they're more qualitative and descriptive in nature. It's a strange thing for me as a qualitative researcher to say, but I really wanted to see more data, and our position as a project team was really actually that these reports do need more data and more evidence of impact to ensure transparency. There was, however, that was a point where we as an evaluation team disagreed with the majority of voices in the sector. We felt that it would be better for that data to be framed with the description and the narrative from the institution to help tell that story and make sense of that data. A few kind of just indicators, I suppose, of the outcomes from the surveys. So on the top left you can see responses from public HEI representatives. So the question there, I don't know if it's large enough for you guys to read, was does the AQR interact with or complement other forms of reporting? Green is somewhat, yellow is no blue whatsoever. So definitely we have a sense that there might be work to do there. The responses on the bottom right, your right, yes, are from QQI representatives. So there's relative alignment there, possibly a bit more positivity internally.
Thanks, Cathy. So just we wanted to conclude this morning or this afternoon by highlighting some of the challenges and opportunities, less for QQI who've had this report for several months now, but for you, the providers who complete the AQRs on an annual basis. And so to consider the ways in which the benefits of the AQR process can be better harnessed within your own institutions and to serve you better. So 3 critical questions that we identified and which I know are going to be picked up to some extent in the panel discussion that we're going to be having shortly. So the questions we identified were, how can institutions make the AQR process work for them? And what we mean by that is, how can this time-consuming, labour-intensive, mandatory process be incorporated or integrated into local processes so that you can reduce duplication of effort and it can be used to stimulate wider internal conversations around quality assurance. The second question was, how can institutions evidence the impact of QA measures in the AQR? Because that was a really significant theme that came up repeatedly, and in fact we heard about it this morning in the current thematic analysis report. So the impact of the really important QA measures that you describe in these reports is often left undiscussed, and that is a self-acknowledged vulnerability. And then the third question was, how can institutions make their AQR report more visible and relevant to staff? And so what we heard from you through the surveys and through those focus groups that we conducted is that often outside of, say, the QA office maybe or the registrar's office, these reports aren't particularly widely known, they may not be distributed, they may not be used very well. We did hear that there were some issues that they're not the most easily navigable reports, but if QQI were to address those issues, what is it that can be done with institutions to make these documents both more visible and relevant to your own staff?